Hello everyone and welcome back to the Politics Simplified YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 2026 United States Senate election in Maine. Particularly, we're going to be talking about Troy Jackson, the presumptive Democratic nominee who will be replacing Graham Platner as the Democratic candidate on the ballot in November. So Troy Jackson is the former state Senate president of Maine. So basically, a little context here. Susan Collins is the incumbent senator. She's a Republican. She is seeking a sixth term. And the two Democrats, the two major Democratic candidates who were running against her in the primary were Graham Platner, running on a progressive platform, and Janet Mills, the current governor of Maine, running on a more establishment platform. Mills ended up dropping out, and Platner won the primary with around 72% of the vote. However, there was a major scandal and some very serious allegations made against Graham Platner in early July, and he dropped out of the race. He withdrew from the race, which led to a Democratic nominating convention. So because Platner dropped out of the race, and there was therefore no longer a Democratic candidate in the race, the Democrats had to hold a nominating convention to select a new candidate. And Troy Jackson, the former president of the Maine State Senate, received approximately 456 of the selected delegates. I want to say there were, I don't know how many delegates exactly there were. Looking into this, I think there were 500. Yes, 500 delegates. Troy Jackson received around 456 of them. And so he is now considered the presumptive nominee. And the reason I want to talk about this is because he is the strongest candidate in November of the all the candidates who went for the nomination after Platner dropped out. Troy Jackson is the strongest and the most likely to defeat Susan Collins in November. So if we go down to the general election polling, well, this is in the primary, but if we go down to the general election and we go down to polling, hypothetical polling, Shanna Bellows, the Secretary of State of Maine, was one of the other candidates who sought the nomination after Platner dropped out. She was tied with Susan Collins in two polls. One of those polls showed Susan Collins leading Troy Jackson, and the other one showed Troy Jackson leading Susan Collins. In the aggregate polling, Troy Jackson leads Susan Collins by around 2%. And Graham Platner, in the last poll after those serious allegations were reported, Platner was trailing Susan Collins by 5%. And if you look at all of this other hypothetical polling, you see that, and polling is, and I'll say this again and again, polling is useful information, but it's not the only thing you should use to make a forecast on how you think an election will turn out. So, I mean, if you look, both a Democratic-sponsored poll and a Republican-sponsored poll, both show that a generic Democrat leads Susan Collins. Now, Dan Claiborne, another one, I believe he sought the nomination as well. He did. He withdrew and he endorsed Jackson. There was one poll that did show him in the lead against Susan Collins, but this was done back in September of 2025. Janet Mills, very much back and forth, about even with Susan Collins. Nirav Shah, once again, leading by one or tied, and against Jordan Wood, Wood was down 9%, and that is the same poll that showed Jackson leading Susan Collins by 5%. So another interesting thing is fundraising is another thing to talk about when talking about which candidates are in strong positions. And because Troy Jackson is the presumptive nominee and the quarter just ended, he doesn't have any fundraising numbers yet. So he won't have fundraising numbers until October, most likely. Susan Collins has quite a bit of cash on hand. I would say about what you would expect for a candidate running for a sixth term, a pretty large amount of campaign cash available, and campaign finance, doing well financially as a campaign is not the sole predictor of an election outcome, but definitely having cash on hand and the ability to buy ads, buy literature, send out mailers, that definitely helps. And you look at the general election, inside elections tilt Republican, 4 toss-ups, lean Democrat, tilt Democrat, very much a close race. But once again, like I said, I'm not saying Troy Jackson is 100% going to win, but what I am saying is that I feel in the nominating convention, Democrats definitely picked the strongest nominee that they could have. And when we go back to previous elections, in 2020, Susan Collins won 51% of the vote, but she still won by close to 9 points. And then we go back to 2014. Susan Collins won with 68% of the vote, actually against Shanna Bellows. If we go back to 2008, when Barack Obama won the state of Maine by a safe margin of victory, Susan Collins still won by 22 points. If we go back to 2002, Susan Collins won by 16 points, almost 17. If we go back to 1996, Susan Collins' first term, she won by 5 points, and that was her closest election. And if you look at the 2 elections where there were major third-party vote shares, 1996 and 2020, and those were Susan Collins' 2 closest elections, but the major party vote shares definitely didn't improve the Democrats' chances. You see in a lot of races where if there's a Libertarian nominee, there's usually an argument that that Libertarian nominee is essentially pulling support from the Republican nominee. And whether that's true or not, it just depends on the election. But it definitely looks like while Susan Collins' share of the vote decreases, her margin of victory is still pretty comfortable. I would call a 9-point margin of victory, especially when Joe Biden was carrying the state of Maine by 9 points. That's an 18-point overperformance of Donald Trump. In terms of vote share, that's a 6-point overperformance of Donald Trump. I would call that a pretty healthy electoral outcome, a pretty good electoral outcome. So Susan Collins is a very strong candidate. And especially being the only Republican up for re-election in a state that Kamala Harris won in 2024, and the Republican Senate campaign committee is definitely going to spend a lot of money getting Susan Collins re-elected. And like I said, this is going to be a close race. This is going to be a race that a lot of people are watching. This is going to be a race that, people will call a key race. But Troy Jackson is definitely the Democrat who's the strongest candidate here. So, I mean, we have an election here where you have the Republicans who have nominated Susan Collins, probably the strongest candidate they could nominate to retain this seat in Maine. And the Democrats have now chosen Troy Jackson to replace Graham Platner on the ballot because Platner withdrew. And Troy Jackson is the strongest nominee they could have selected. And granted, we don't have a ton of polling yet. We don't have a ton of fundraising numbers yet. But, I mean, we'll obviously get more of that information as we get closer to the election. But if I go down to polling here, Troy Jackson is the only one who's leading in an aggregate polling. I mean, if you go down to, Dan Claiborne, he led in one poll of registered voters late last summer, actually. But Troy Jackson is the only one who's leading in aggregate polling. And now, granted, it's within the margin of victory. It's within the margin of error, rather, sorry. So, for example, 43-48, margin of error of 5.8%, within the margin of error. The poll Susan Collins is leading in within the margin of error. The University of New Hampshire poll, plus or minus 2.9%, he's leading by 3%. Once again, close enough to say it's within the margin of error. So this is definitely going to be a close race, but the Democrats have chosen the strongest possible nominee to win in November. That's all for this video. I just wanted to say thank you all for watching. Thank you for sticking around if you watched to the end of the video. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and make sure to turn the notification bell on to get notified whenever I post a new video. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a great day.